Good evening. I'm Richard Sommer, Dean of the Daniels Faculty, and it's my pleasure tonight to welcome you here for this year's Michael Hough Ontario Association of Landscape Architects Visiting Critic Lecture featuring Gary Hilderbrand. Before we get started, and there's going to be, I'm giving the pre-introduction tonight. I'd like to quickly draw your attention to some other upcoming events at the Daniels Faculty. This Thursday, I hope you'll join us at the Isabel Bader Theater at 7 o'clock for an event entitled Uber Urbanism. And no, it's not about cabs, and because Uber existed as a term before the disruptive cab company. But it's part of the Daniels Forest series, and Uber Urbanism will explore whether there's still utility in making distinctions between traditional ideas of urban agglomerations that we associate with the term city and broader patterns of urbanization that are related to, how shall I put it, the technological mastery of the entire Earth's surface and how these tensions play out. And really we'll be examining questions such as whether distinction between the rural and the urban, or society and nature, or city and suburb are still useful distinctions to make, or whether there are other ways of conceptualizing urbanization. So we're bringing in two interesting speakers for this event. One, a geographer and professor named Neil Brenner. He's director of the Urban Theory Lab at Harvard and the author of many interesting books on this subject, his latest having the subtitle Planetary Urbanism. And Jesse Le Cavalier, a designer and architect and theorist teaching at New Jersey Institute of Technology, whose work examines the logistical architecture of major actors in the new economy, such as Walmart and Amazon. So Jesse will be looking Neil Brenner will be making an argument for rethinking our attitude towards planning and urbanization, and Le Cavalier will be showing us ways in which there is actually an architecture emerging under our noses that is, in a way, not necessarily welcome, but already present alternative to the way in which the center of our cities are developing. So the tickets for this event are free, but there are only a few left. We're actually oversold, but we usually oversell these at the Bader Theater, and we'll also have a rush line for non-ticket holders on Thursday. I'd also like to point out, given the subject of tonight's lecture, that tomorrow is the last day for you, and I mean students, faculty, people in the community, to give feedback on the University of Toronto's design competition for the remaking of King's College Circle and other landmark areas on the related areas in the St. George campus. There are 4 design teams that have been shortlisted in and their schemes are posted online, right, Rob? A lot of people have been giving interesting comments on that. And I want to encourage all of you that haven't to have a look and provide your comments. So you'll find that link on the online survey on our website, as well as the main University of Toronto website. So now on to tonight's lecture. I'd like to thank the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects for their ongoing support of the Michael Hough OALA Visiting Critic in Landscape Architecture, and also the lecture tonight by the same name. In 2003, the association established an endowment at the faculty to enrich the academic experience of students in our Master of Landscape Architecture program. The OALA support has enabled Daniels faculty students to benefit from the creative input of outstanding visiting professors, practitioners, and critics in the landscape architecture field, and we've had some amazing people here to do this, including tonight's guest. This lecture was named in honor of the late Michael Hough, who actually I met when I first came to the school and came to some of the lectures and presentations before we lost him. Michael Hough founded the University of Toronto's Landscape Architecture program and pioneered an approach to landscape design that incorporated urban ecology, urban planning, and long-term development strategies. This was an extremely progressive and in some ways radical approach that he took that has been influential on the whole field as it exists today. Some people are just actually catching on to some of his ideas. We are very pleased to be able to pay continuing tribute to Michael Hough's legacy through the OALA's generous support of our programs and students. Joining us tonight in our audience is Bridget Hough. Mrs. Hough, we're pleased to have you and a number of your guests to join us here tonight, so welcome. I would now like to call upon Chris Hart, Secretary of the OALA Council, to say a few words on behalf of his organization.
Hello, my name is Chris Hart. I'm the Secretary of the Ontario Association of Landscape Architects at this time. It gives me great pleasure to be here this evening. I'm pleased to be here on behalf of OALA to welcome you to the Michael Hough Ontario Association of Landscape Architects Visiting Critic Lecture. And the OALA sponsors 2 or 3 similar lectures each year, as you understand. Tonight's lecture is presented annually by an august practitioner and is sponsored partially by the OALA to bring an international figure in contemporary urban landscapes to the faculty. I'm sure a great deal of work goes on behind the scenes by staff and faculty at the University of Toronto, and I'd like to thank you very much for your involvement. And I also want to thank this year's visiting critic, Mr. Gary Hilderbrand, for gracing us with his attendance and participation in the lecture series of the Daniels faculty at the University of Toronto. I'm looking forward to this presentation, as I'm sure you all are. And as well, I would like you, especially the students here, to feel free to contact the OALA for further information regarding other professional activities of the OALA and for help in obtaining professional credentials. You'll find our office staff in Toronto to be very friendly and helpful and welcoming, and I hope that you'll all enjoy this evening's presentation as much as I'm sure I will. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I'm now going to ask Associate Professor Alissa North, the director of our Master of Landscape Architecture program, to come to the podium and introduce tonight's speaker. Alissa.
Hi there. I also want to express my thanks to the OALA for the ongoing support for our students and support for all of us as landscape architects through events such as this, as well as share my excitement that Ms. Hough has joined us for the lecture, so thank you very much. Gary Hilderbrand is a founding partner of Reed Hilderbrand, located in Watertown, Massachusetts. A committed practitioner, teacher, critic, and writer with 3 acclaimed books, Gary is professor in practice at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he has taught since 1990. He holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture, cum laude, and obtained his Master in Landscape Architecture with distinction from Harvard's Graduate School of Design. His honors include Harvard University's Charles Eliot Traveling Fellowship, the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture, the Architectural League's Emerging Voices Award with Douglas Reed, and the 2013 ASLA Firm of the Year Award. Gary is a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects. In the most recent awards issue of Landscape Architecture magazine, many of you have likely noticed that Reed Hilderbrand has taken 3 2015 ASLA awards. And digressing, in this same issue are 3 of our own winning MLA thesis works. Also, in this same issue, Gary has authored The Wild Grid, an article about Dan Kiley's South Garden at the Art Institute of Chicago and how it has matured since the late 1960s. The article captures not only Gary's profound understanding of and passion for modern landscape architecture, but also reveals his unique thoughtfulness and articulate intensity. The piece exemplifies his precise reading of landscape and landscape architecture, which clearly translates into his own practice as a landscape architect. I've known Gary for close to 20 years, as I was first introduced to his incredibly thoughtful nature when he attended this faculty's BLA reviews in 1997 and again in 1998, corresponding exactly with the graduation years of our program's Professor Pete North and myself. And Gary, our academic careers will forever remain indebted to you. Being a student of Gary's in graduate school was also a revelatory experience where to achieve the writing perfection that one knew Gary expected, it took 5 times as long to write text that was a fraction of the length. Gary's combination of astute observation and pursuit of excellence positions his work at Reed Hilderbrand in a class of its own, and I have no hesitation in stating that his practice sets the ideal for achievement in landscape architecture. I'm extremely pleased that Gary was able to join us as this year's Michael Hough OALA Visiting Critic to share with us the current works of his firm in the context of Reed Hilderbrand's 2013 monograph, Visible Invisible, and tomorrow to share his time with our MLA students. Please help me in welcoming Gary Hilderbrand.
Good evening. Thank you, Alissa. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for coming, Ms. Hough. It's a great honor. Really, it is a great honor to have been asked to fulfill this lecture in honor of Michael Hough. I had a chance to meet Michael Hough a few times in my visits here in the 90s, and Richard's words about him were really right on. I think that his ideas about the city weren't quite heard as soundly as they should have been while he was pounding his fist on the table, and he knew how to do that. But they are really relevant for us all. You know, it's also just a privilege to participate in what I think of as a long and enduring exchange between the school I teach at and the school you teach at and study in. I know Ed Fife curated relationships years and years ago, Rob Reich and John Dennehy with Carl Steinitz in the 90s. We've had, of course, the great legacy of George Baird here and at Harvard, our Charles Waldheim legacy here and at Harvard. It's a long list, really, of those kinds of exchanges. I had the really great fortune to be on a committee that was tasked, Rob's laughing here, was a university committee that was tasked with the transition of this school to a graduate school. And I think it's very pleasing to learn that you're considering undergraduate education in the Daniels faculty again. But that was a pretty interesting time for me as a young teacher and administrator. I was a program director at Harvard at the time, to be invited by Bridget and Larry Richards to see the insides of the workings of a place like this back then. And I have to say, and I should mention Larry Richards and Detlef Mertens, who was really instrumental in that work as well. And so many other exchanges, Richard and Laura, of course. And I am teaching with Jane Hutton, a distinguished graduate of this program, and for the last 5 years have been sharing the first semester core studio and landscape architecture with Jane, a tremendous privilege. We have had so many great students from this program. I should mention Pierre Bélanger, who came to us after he completed his degree here, and who returned to the Daniels faculty and is now an esteemed member of our faculty and a great colleague for me. Mark Laird is here tonight. Mark and I shared an office in the GSD for too few years, maybe only 4 or 5, and so many relationships, which makes it all the more meaningful for me to be here. I also thoroughly enjoyed a conversation today in Bridget's and Rob's studio, and I like to accept the honor of lecturing in a school when they let me talk to the students, and so that was a treat, and I look forward to that tomorrow as well. So it's very pleasing for me to be here tonight. What's visible and what's invisible? I show you 2 slides here which maybe in some ways epitomize in my practice the idea that we could be telescopic that we could be working at the scale of a very large wetland, a freshwater marsh in western Massachusetts, or the creation of a square in downtown Boston that's about twice the size of this room. And I think of these varying scales as being telescopic. And when it came time to try to put 20 years of extremely varied kinds of projects into a single book, it occurred to me that it was interesting to talk about what you cannot see in the work. I have to reference Peter Walker, who perhaps owns the idea that landscapes quickly become invisible, in his important book, Invisible Gardens, with Melanie Simo in the late 90s. There are lots of things you can't see, and we made a conscious decision in this book not to have renderings or 3D models or any of the intermediate objects that take us on a path to the completion of a work, even a body of work, except for the plan. There are 60 plans in the book, and this comes from our belief in the kind of preeminence, I would say, of the plan. Others will argue that the plan doesn't maybe deserve that status. But the plan for a landscape architect is the conceit of being comprehensive, of carrying really everything in the project. What you can't see in the work is the underlying structure, the life support that exists just below the skin of the ground. You can't see what we erased on a site, what we edited out. You can't see what we blocked from your view. We can't see what's beyond your cone of vision. And in a momentary experience in a landscape, you can barely see nature's force. You can barely see growth or maturation or cycles or seasons. Those things require time. And so in a way, the unwritten part of that thesis is that what you can't see is time, and time is the essential thing in a landscape architectural work, no matter what scale. Now, there's another thing that's sometimes invisible, and that's the people who do the work, and I try my best to give my colleagues credit. I know some of you know some of the characters on the screen. We have a very dedicated group of 40 individuals who work hard in this space. We've moved from Watertown to Cambridge, and we moved into that funny little CERT building in Central Square, and we got ourselves a very nice horizon to work in with a decent library. I'm so pleased that Alissa mentioned the South Garden by Dan Kiley, which appeared in my article in Landscape Architecture magazine this month, because I wanted to talk before the work. Really, I wanted to speak a little bit as an academic and to speak specifically about the role of vegetation in the city. And it was very nice to be asked, because Dan Kiley's garden at the Art Institute in Chicago was given the Landmark Award by the American Society of Landscape Architects this year. That means a work that is 50 years old or less. It actually is exactly 50 years old, but which is distinguished in its own right. And it's a pretty competitive award. And so I was asked by Brad McKee, the editor of Landscape Architecture magazine, if I would just write a small piece about it. And so I spent some days there, and I've always known this garden. I've always loved it. But when you're asked to examine something and to come out with something useful, then you kind of have to look hard. And the more I sat there and walked around it, the harder it was to believe this incredible carpet of vegetation over my head and the incredible quality of light and space that happens beneath it. And so I realized, I think, and part of this comes through just talking about it with my partner Doug and others, This grid of trees, there's 40-something of them, if there are any farmers in the room, they will know that it's very strange to find Critiga's Krosgali in the middle of the city. You see the thorns? I mean, this is not a tree you really expect to sit next to. You find this in the edge of the field where it gets a lot of sun and where it makes a hedgerow. It's a kind of component of the hedgerow. Well, Kylie knew that tree because he had hedgerows in Vermont. And I don't know, seems like a master stroke to me. Did he know that they would eventually just grow together like that? What's really, I think, the physiological part of this is that this is a shade intolerant species, cannot grow in the shade. And so it also can't grow more than about 15 feet tall, or 20, maybe 20. And so these trees for the last 50 years have just been kind of getting bigger in girth and twisting around their core heartwood. Their leaves have been growing only at the tops of the branches because they can't tolerate shade. Basically, you have a kind of layer of leaves, and then you have branches and thorns, twigs and thorns. They can only grow longer. They can't grow higher. And so, anyway, this seemed to me to be some kind of, either a kind of genius stroke or a beautiful accident. I'm very interested in the role of vegetation in the city, as I said, and I have been for the last couple of years preparing a project called Vegetal City through a seminar, which I teach in the spring I taught this past spring with my colleague, the historian and landscape architect, Sonia Dumpelman. And we've been looking at significant urban plantations. You will all, I think, recognize the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. What does it mean to have a forest of maturing trees, pines, 3 kinds of pines, in what you would think is a completely hermetic fragment, right? A hortus conclusus. This is a kind of classic hortus conclusus. You can only get there by going through the building. But the plants can get there anyway. And so, first of all, the pine forest is not something that can be sustained. It cannot regenerate itself because the pines can't grow in shade. However, there is, if you look at just the past 15 years, another set of species has been introduced through bird life, essentially, from adjoining urban plantations, from the adjoining urban forest, that will transform this, hopefully under a management regime, maybe not. The Philippopos Hill in Athens, which was this incredible work that I admired for years until I was finally able to see it, by the architect Pikiones, who made these fantastic pathways, which are all meant to, in a sense, in honor of viewing the Parthenon and the Acropolis, planted in olive. I lectured in Athens in February of last year, and because I mentioned that I'd walked on the Philippopos Hill that day, and I mentioned my keen interest in Pikiones's way of making a paved surface, and as I'll reference later, my own way of thinking about those paved surfaces in the city as being something of an integument or a skin. I was asked the question and after the lecture, would I render my opinion about whether they should cut down the trees that are now hiding the view on the Philippopos Hill? Which I immediately said, well, sure I would, because the reason this is there was for viewing the Acropolis. But in fact, as my students have learned, there are more spontaneous species in the Philippopos Hill than there are olives. And they are taking over, in a sense. And so I'm on a quest here to understand how something was conceived, how it was implemented, in this case by a great teacher in an atelier with his students and apprentices, how it was altered after its life was set in motion, and how it performs today, and what kind of future does it have? These are the questions that we're asking of major urban plantations, including one at the 9/11 Memorial in New York. On the right is a plan by one of our students, which indicates this is a single species of tree, one tree. I forget how many, I think 100 and something. Swamp white oak. This indicates a winter view of the retention of leaves, which oaks will tend to do. And the student surmises, and I consent to this view, the microclimate that is affecting the way that these trees will hold their leaves. You'll notice that the trees that have the moisture from the two great waterfalls are still retaining their leaves in February. And this comes from kind of data collection on site. And then trees that are planted in tubes and boxes are behaving differently than trees that are planted in a more vegetative, a more horticultural soil, let's say. We've looked at plane trees in China, in Nanjing in particular. These fantastic images are able to be captured because there is this very strange pruning regime that is from the French occupation period in the 20s and 30s, which did something that's kind of devastating to the way the tree wants to be. It doesn't want to be that way. And then produces that incredible spatiality there. Where I think, especially with the plane tree, I think that the space actually has color. Somehow color is transmitted in refraction and reflection from the bark in these trees. We've looked at the question about why would you have a pine forest in the middle of the city on the Rio in Madrid? Is that a sustainable project? And so we've embarked on this multi-year project, and I was telling Alissa earlier that this comes out of a concern for, well, let me say this. Landscape architecture's grasp on the urban scene has, without any doubt, and in some measure, thanks to this school and others, really taken great hold. And the opportunity for landscape architecture is enormous in the urban condition. I'm also expressing a great hope that we don't forget the things that traditionally come from landscape architecture, education, and its professional roots. That is the urban forestry part of this, which, frankly, scientists, urban foresters, have a better handle on than landscape architects do. And my project, in some ways, is to try to close that gap. From here on, I'll talk mainly about built projects, but occasionally I'll insert a couple of slides that will relate to things that we're currently working on. And the first project is a major touchstone for our practice, the Central Wharf in Boston. We had a little bit of urban work done, up until the time we got this commission, but not so much. And we found that we really had to learn how to work in the city. We've been able to extend that knowledge, and today a project that really comes out of that urban work is that we're actually helping Harvard University to figure out how to build a landscape infrastructure for its expansion across the river from Cambridge and into Alston. And so we've managed to get some serious commitment from Harvard to a serious urban forestry approach. There's a lot of fiction in the drawing on the left. This is simply unable to be disclosed at the time the drawing was made. We're actually now, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but we're working on that now, and that pattern is actually going all the way to the future train station, which will happen right there. There are some great things that will come out of that effort. They began very modestly for our firm. We were invited in a competition to propose a design for this tiny little space next to the New England Aquarium. And we just really didn't know how to do the work at that time. But I had always been interested in a way of seeing the city through the lens of landscape. And these two photographs, Stieglitz on the left and Steichen on the right, 1902, 1907, have been touchstones for me. More importantly, we became fascinated with the idea that the surface of the city is a living membrane because there's an active biophysical world beneath it that must be there and must be healthy if we're to sustain a vegetative life, a vegetated spatiality above that surface. And so these are both Auger photographs. The one on the right, the idea that that living surface is really handmade, that the blocks are placed and tamped, and if you need to, you can pick them up and put them back down again, and we do that. This was the site of that, and our very early idea for this was that it simply be a shaded grove of trees. We were told by the authorities in the city, the redevelopment authority, that there will be no trees on that site. Well, why not? Well, because you have this great ensemble of 3 centuries of great architecture, and we simply can't hide that. That point of view actually meant that this entire part of the reconstruction of the central artery in the Rose Kennedy Greenway is almost devoid of trees. We persisted, and we ultimately got our way. This is what we were dealing with. That's what it looked like. And the property was simply this. This was the property. We, through about a year's worth of work, expanded it to make these actually the minor streets that they really should be. And our idea was simply that we should tilt the plane up so that you could see the water sheet by the time you got to there, because you're just across the old Atlantic Avenue from the harbor, and that we should create a single living medium in which we could grow these trees. You know, we were doing research in design studios at the time and asking the question, well, why do we plant trees in conditions that will allow them to only grow 7 to 10 years in the city? Why do we not provide trees what they need? And so we asked the question of our soil scientists, and there's other research to corroborate it. What does it need? What does the tree need if you would even want a tree to be a mature canopy in the city? What would it need? Well, the answer is 1,000 cubic feet of good living soil. There are other things, but that's essentially it. Well, that's a lot. You know, walking down St. George Street today, which was rebuilt 10 years ago or so, I think those trees have a couple of 100 cubic feet if they're lucky. And they won't indeed really live to great maturity, but we really wanted this to grow up as a single body of trees, and it's doing so. We provided about 1,200 cubic feet of soil per tree. You have to be able to drive on it, support the paving, all of the rest. Anyway, I'll flip through. This is a kind of in-the-kitchen look at what happens. There are structural supports. It's a mess of spaghetti of utilities underneath. You can see all of the things we were working with there. All of this had to be on piles. You know, this is really a former estuary. It wasn't land until 150 years ago. Structure to hold up, no spread footings, but structure to hold up the granite walls and seats and so on. And then I'll just kind of narrate this. This is pedantic, but as I said, this is a touchstone for how we do work today in the city at any scale. So this is the surface. we finally got through the problem of not having any trees on this site when we went from a disarray of trees. First of all, we started with a grid, and the client, who was a philanthropist, said, I won't have a grid of trees here. And that grid actually stretched all the way across. And then we had them in an irregular way, and then finally we figured out that if you put them in an arc, that the architect in charge of urban design for the BRA might finally get it, and he did. And so we got our way. There's what the structure looks like going in. There's the mass of soil. I'll be critical of this. Our client also required something like a garden. I would have gotten rid of it, and I still wish we could. We also wanted, in the same way that you see in the ASLA photograph, we wanted the idea that the surface is organic, that it's not a fixed condition with a piece of metal that no one can pick up. So when these trees grow, we pick out some of the cobbles and let the root flares show. Of course, we have to capture the rainwater, which is done in an almost invisible way, then delivered below grade to the root balls, and then finally drained and irrigated when needed, and also drained. And because we have upwelling here, because it used to be a tide marsh, we also have the capability of sending the water off into the municipal sewer system. So it seemed significant to us to plant trees close together, fairly large trees, one per truck. It's not very green. But the idea that that surface could have been made any time, maybe timeless in a sense, but living and alive. We were invited to work with a really great architect in Chicago, John Ronan, on the Poetry Foundation's first building for its own headquarters. John had been conceiving the project as a kind of building behind a screen. The Poetry Foundation encapsulates its mission with the following words: poetry is an open door. And this project, really, one has to give great credit to John here, is really a kind of open door on the street corner. My corollary to the thing that's on the boards now is that we're working with your dear friend Nader Tirani and Katie Faulkner on a courtyard in which we also are collectively, in a shared way, trying to make something seem as if it were completely integral inside and out. We started with the idea that you can see one thing through another. That's embodied beautifully in the palimpsest that we're all aware of. I think of this beautiful painting of Paul Klee, which is really taking a mosaic technique and delivering what Colin Rowe and Robert Slutsky would call phenomenal transparency. I think John really achieved this. This is the reading room of the Poetry Foundation, and in the evening, you can see that thing light blasting right through the screen, through the open door, as it were. And our task was to conceive of a garden which would lead you to the door, which happens to be well inside the court. This is the threshold, the open door, and this is the entrance, and so you simply must go through this garden. John was very keen on the pattern we devised here and decided to take it indoors. And so the floor of the reading room and the library and the arrival lobby were cast in the same concrete as our surfaces outside. We have a tremendous body of soil underneath this. We learned how to do that, and we learned how to keep it alive, partly by infiltrating through these little moss garden elements. And so this is one of those projects that I was mentioning to the students today. It somewhat captures the paradigm of the inside-outside thing we all like to speak about. A great project for us with John. we don't really work much outside the U.S., but with a client of ours who's an American, we've had the opportunity to work at Marsh Court. I should mention here that Mark Laird has been very helpful in many conversations about Marsh Court and our ongoing work there over the past 6 years. Now, that project is underway. And here's another project that we're just getting under construction with. This isn't really like Marsh Court so much, but this meadow, which is 70 acres, shaped like a mitt, on the eastern edge of Cleveland, is one of the southernmost and easternmost meadows for ground nesting birds we call bobolinks. And the owner of this recently purchased property is he's going to build an art center there and a home for himself. But his primary interest was in preserving the habitat for the bobolinks, which we were losing. We're losing it for a couple of reasons. One is that multiflora rose is taking over the meadow, and that's bad for ground nesting, and it's good for the predators, which is not good for the birds. And the other reason is that the habitat is moving north because of increased temperatures. And so we've just built a half mile of road on this property, and over the next couple of years, we'll be building something quite strong. Marsh Court was built for Edward Johnson by the team of Sir Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll. We don't have good evidence of Jekyll's work here. Fantastic plot of ground. And it sits right here on the River Tess, which is a good fishing river, and was so in the early 20th century. This was built as a kind of lodge, I guess you'd say, for a stockbroker to bring his London friends down for hunting and fishing. And it's famous for these images, which appear in Lawrence Weaver's book, among other places. Really an incredible house. Today, a grade 1 listed house, completely restored to astonishing standards. There's a famous photograph also in Weaver's book of the Secret Garden. This is an indication of Johnson's original holdings, and this is the current holding. The owners have just been able to acquire a little more land, and so we are madly at work on another phase of this project. The land sits in this very interesting swath of chalk, which looks like that. You can cut it pretty easily, and it'll stand up like that. And Lutyens figured out how to make something exquisite out of that. Not only with chalk, but with flint. So you have chalk, flint, and terracotta, all of which come from, a mule cart away, making this very strange and wonderful building. It sits just to the south of a great copse of hazel and oak. And we know that this copse is old because this is the condition, already a mature forest, perhaps several hundred years. And then there's the chalk pit, the quarry. And then there's Lutyens' project of carving and hauling and making something brilliant. I'm going to show you photographs of this drive because this is the Tess, and we're in the floodplain there as you enter, and you come along the floodplain, and then you rise up in a cut. Lutyens cut the driveway in very steeply because you can do that in chalk. So there's a way in from the country road. This is what that chalk cut is like after 100 years of spontaneous vegetation. Really, really something. And it's so great that we've been able to keep that driveway just wide enough for Vauxhall. Over the years, the drive from the lodge to the house had been kind of sanded down and widened. This was a boys' school for a very long time. Then it went into private hands, and then our clients purchased it from that owner. But in the meantime, this had been kind of smoothed over. And one of our ideas was to try to put that back. And that idea got some traction. Contractors thought we were out of our minds making slopes this steep. They'd just never done that. We hadn't done it either, but you can do it in chalk. That's the thing. You can cut the chalk that steep, and you can also pack it, and it'll stay there. And then it looks like that. So we got that skinny drive back. We got the cut drive back by filling. This is one of the funny things. The cut and fill operations on this project are almost a kind of brain teaser. But there it is, in the early spring, back, in this case, pretty close, I think, to what Lutyens had conceived. Another view from Weaver's book of the tennis courts and these great hedges, which were creating a kind of boundary for the house, kind of tucking the house, as it were, this massive house. You're seeing it before the ballroom addition. This too had been sanded down over the years. Actually, there it is, kind of sanded down. And so here we had another crazy idea, a little bit of reverse cut and fill. This stuff gets pretty steep. And there we were, moving it around, and we replanted the hedge, and it's really coming back to very close to that feeling you get from the photographs. And the gardens are in progress. This is the first year of planting. This is earlier this summer. And this was in, I'm going to say this was in August or early September. What I love about this image is that we've worked very hard, Kristen Fredrickson and I, and Doug Reed, and I have to credit Mark Laird also with this, worked very hard to consider a planting palette for which we had no original evidence, except the photographs, which don't give you all that much. Mark is an expert at reconstruction and conjecture, and so we were very, really fortunate to have his advice here. I shouldn't be blaming him like that for our adventure, but what I really love here is the color palette. When you think of the way this rather beautifully merges with the terracotta, the flint, and the chalk, and the distant hill, I think we're achieving something. This is the path out to yonder. This is a family that makes this their home, and so they have their 21st century needs, and we have our interest in carrying on the work that was started here 110 years ago. So we've just finished planting a grove of 100 beech, kind of the analog of the old copse. And this takes work. It's very hard to do this over the distance. This is the reason we don't really do much international work. We want to build the work. We want to build it carefully. We have some very good hands on the ground here, and they're starting to achieve something out there that's pretty good. This is an earlier photograph of that grove. What an astonishing thing to work on a project like that. Our work at Long Dock in Beacon started in 2004 and finished a third phase last year. It was recognized nicely this year with the top design award from ASLA. So we learned now how to work on the waterfront. We're currently working with shop architects on the rebuilding of Pier 4 in Boston. And so the building is interesting, but my interest is in actually rebuilding a very broken down pier next to the ICA without erasing some of the failings and the kind of historic lore that are there, to make a pier that is not a nifty, new, and clean, shiny pier, but a pier that somehow engages the water in very different ways. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, and I climbed these mountains with my family. That's where I learned to love trees. And I had the chance to go back there and to work on this peninsula of land in Beacon, right next to the Dia Foundation. So that's a bucolic thing, which my neighbors, when I was growing up, and organization that came out of this group, Scenic Hudson, have worked so hard to preserve. And it's bucolic, it's a fantastic place. It's also a hellish place. And, on a fall day in a storm like this, that's a pretty tough site. Of course, it's all fill. The edge of land was back here. This is what happens in the winter storms. This is what happens when the site turns into a junkyard. These are the remnants of a bridge paving that this guy that owned the junkyard accepted as salvage to stabilize his sinking site. I mean, it was really something. Just a very tough site with a lot of remediation going on and many phases of construction, as I mentioned. So those of you who know the Dia Foundation, it's right there. That's where my dad worked when I was a kid. This little ideogram will tell you some of the history. So it was a long dock, right? Then it was a railroad siding. So it went from shoreline to a big fill, kind of like the Fan Pier in Boston. Then it was a fuel storage site, then a refuse site. My father used to buy used car parts there. And then Scenic Hudson and the city of Beacon decided to try to turn it around. So again, a multi-phase project, working with things I'd never faced before. I didn't even know what a hydrodynamicist did. And I was telling students earlier today, in 2005, I got a call from this client. And she was very concerned about something, and she said, I want to know what you think, how in developing this plan, we're going to recognize that the tide is going to rise here. Okay, 2005, and I said to her, really? We've come a long ways in 10 years. This is a kind of encapsulation of a profound set of realizations that have come to pass in our professional lives. From things like this. This is halfway through phase 2 construction. It was just a terror for us to have that happen. This is Hurricane Irene. We are at 90% complete, and we had Hurricane Irene. Now the good thing is that we'd gotten the right consultants and we'd figured out what you have to do to armor the site. And those funny shapes are buttresses. And they're intertidal wetlands, some created, some were existing because of the impoundment of those concrete slabs, which we cleaned off the asphalt and replaced as a parking space all along there. So the water can seep in, but the debris will largely be held out in this site, thanks to those big buttresses, which we had a great time making. A lot of heartache to finish them, but I should mention that ARO, Stephen Cassell and Adam Urinsky did a fantastic job in our little kayak pavilion and our wooden beach. Here we are trying to, rebuild a tidal wetland. Just hard. Lots of heartache, as I said, and then really lots of successes. So these buttresses actually become a really interesting spatial device as well. We're on our 3rd generation of grasses. We're getting there, we're getting the good grasses to outcompete the ones that are not desirable. There's some very steep slopes in there. The thing about Hurricane Irene is it told us this works. This place now has resilience. And so it's been a great 10 years This is a little work that George Trackus, the artist George Trackus, was building when we came onto the project in 2004. Again, that incredibly bucolic place way out on the river. The river's a mile wide here. Great bucolic place and also a tough place, and you have to find the way to make both of those work. We've just entered our fourth engagement with the idea that we could somehow rescue Boston City Hall Plaza. You know, and people say, really, you're going to try that again? Many have tried, you know, and it's, you know, obviously it's a very storied place. I think its origins are nothing short of incredible. And having looked very, very, very closely at how this plaza was made, I have nothing but admiration for the tenacity and the rigor that was put to making the ground here. Though, nobody was thinking that that ground had to be living. It's a roof, most of it's a roof, it's over tunnels and so on. I also think the building has had a very tawdry history, just a complete lack of stewardship. 3 mayors who disliked it severely. I know you have your own history with difficulties with city halls, and you also have some good stories and some good outcomes there. I hope we will too. Our current effort is now wisely written in a much broader way. We are looking now with a team, Util and Grimshaw Architects, at the potential disruption of all of the city agencies in 4 properties, with the idea that there's too much property and that there may be value captured in the reorganization, and there may be a way to fix City Hall. And so I think there is a new commitment here, and we're quite excited. We're now officially underway. We had a contract signed 10 days ago. I think it's a fantastic building. Really, I couldn't say enough about it. I think these images, these are either Ezra Stoller or Steve Rosenthal. I can't remember who, but to me, they certainly speak of the kind of dignity of a civic life in that time, in the late 1960s. Our government isn't like that anymore. We don't relate to our government that way anymore, and so maybe that idea has run its course. But I think it was a strong one. The monumentality here is inspiring to me. On the other hand, this mayor, the current mayor, ran partly on a campaign to get a soccer field on City Hall Plaza. And this genius little drawing ended up in the Boston Globe after he ranted a bit about you know, what we should do at our front door. He then, when he became mayor, he walked back a little bit from his hubris, and he also talked about it in his first State of the City address. Then they did a ideas competition for free. Why do you do that? You know, I think here's what you get. Here's what you get when you ask for free ideas. That is not the size of a soccer field, I can guarantee it. We've tested that. And then, as a little step, they spent $640 on AstroTurf and chairs. But, you know, incrementally, we will get there. These are a couple of the drawings we did in an earlier effort just to understand the relationship between pattern, the geometry of pattern, and the drainage of that surface, because we know we have to unravel it, we have to reconceive it, and we have to do so incrementally, which is really like probably think about having 3 or 4 different surgeries on an organ. That's kind of my metaphor. The tunnels, the parking garage, roof, you know, there's just all sorts of crazy things. This was from one of our earlier efforts. I kind of firmly believe that we can keep the brick plaza, but it doesn't have to be as vast. we're not in the middle of a medieval city there. So I think that part of the idea wasn't so good. We can resize this, right-size it in a way, without erasing, I think, what are some profoundly good parts of the thing. And just for instance, a quick study about, how we walk into a building today, and in fact, even how we can open a view to a great landmark, Faneuil Hall. So we're hopeful about a new set of ideas that will rejuvenate City Hall. My last project for the night is the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, which officially opened in July of last year, though we're working on our 4th phase of work, which will open next year. I'm going to skip that. I was going to mention our work at Duke University, but so the Clark opened in July of last year to some pretty wide acclaim. This is work with Tadao Ando and Gensler and Annabelle Seldorf. When you study things like Chatsworth or Studley Royal, you just hope you might get one day to do something of that kind of scale or that kind of order. It's wrong to compare these in a way, but you grow up thinking that that's what a real landscape garden might be like, and is there a contemporary way of thinking about the landscape garden? We've tried to do that at the Clark. The first phase of the project, the architects like to say, was the 20,000 square foot mock-up for the 80,000 square foot addition. And that was completed in 2008. You can see this incredible thing. This meadow, of course, is the remnant of what was once a very open and pastoral landscape, which I'll describe in more detail in a minute. And here's the planned version of that. So there's the phase 1. Phase 2 was knocking down the plant here and building an underground plant in the basement of this building. This is the 3rd phase, Ando's building. It's about 80,000 square feet, but 60,000 of it below grade. And a connection, new connection to the museum building, which was built in 1955. This is a building that was built by Pietro Beluschi and Tack in 1973, and which turned the museum over in a funny way. And so we've reoriented the visitor experience entirely. We've picked basically every path and road up and changed it around. And we've tried to make the place where great pastoral art and other kinds of art are experienced in a pastoral place. So we began work on the Clark in 2001, and I think we'll be complete in 2016 or maybe 17. So over that period of time, you try to get to know a place, and so over the years, I've gotten to know the collections well, and I have taken the opportunity to try to tell you about the Clark through a sensibility that comes from what's in their great collections. It's one of the great American collections of painting and decorative arts. There are some master paintings there, and this one always makes me think of the Hortus Conclusus, which is always understood as something enclosed in relation to something beyond its boundaries. I think we've made an enclosed garden of a kind at the Clark with a clear reference to its larger context, a garden within a larger landscape. There are some incredible paintings there, including this extraordinary Claude. And these paintings make us think of stories, and everyone has stories about the Clark. This meadow, Stonehill Meadow, is kind of hallowed ground at the Clark. And so students of Williams and residents of Williamstown and beyond have a deep attachment because of this kind of existence of a fragment of a pastoral landscape that they all identify with in some way, personally, culturally, geographically. There are great pastoral works, and happens that they have 13 paintings by this fantastic American landscape painter, George Inness. This one always reminds me of Kenneth Clark's very droll statement, "If you don't have a shepherd, you don't have the pastoral." But in fact, we have our shepherd. We certainly have cows on the land. This was an open landscape, right? And there is this pastoral history to it. And not so long ago, really. 100 years ago, still very open. 60 years ago, still very open, but starting to be regrowth, starting to be enclosed. There's our two would-be shepherds on the hill. Actually, I think we got a vote of confidence from the cows when they broke out of the fence one day and landed in phase 1, front and center. So we don't have a shepherd, but I think we're getting close to pastoral there. I think Constable is so well represented at the Clark. This painting of the Common led us to think about our work in the Clark as a kind of common, because it's open to the public. It is a public treasure, the Clark's property. And it's in fact a trailhead. You can walk for days if you park at the Clark and go south to the Taconics or north to the Green Mountains. And so in our rebuilding of the Clark landscape, we've tried very hard to keep it rural, to keep it of that character and of that quality. So the paths, the way we make the paths and the way we manage the landscape, where we mow and don't mow, that's all carefully curated to ensure that rural character. Then there's an urbanity as well to it. This is maybe the urbane side, the arrival place. We had to make a bridge, and we decided that we wanted the bridge to sound like you were going over water. So it's made of wood pilings and wood decking. And these paths, which we've been very careful to keep quiet and country-like alongside the drives. The drives are narrow. The bridges are quiet. Here, I think Constable's probably talking about labor. He's making a kind of political commentary. But we think of the Clark as a working landscape also. And we were, I would say, in the early days, Ando was hired in July of 2001. We were hired in August. And in September, he came to the US with a set of studies. There were 9 ways, it's a 9 square, there were 9 ways to expand the Clark. And you could practically close your eyes and draw these if you know Ando's body of work and you know the consistency of that. The thing that was a constant in them was a very big, long bit of water. And we were troubled because we thought it was going to be very hard to do that on this site. This is a highly constrained site. And frankly, we were unconvincing for a couple of years on this until we did our homework and figured out that if you right-sized this thing and made it part of the workings of the building and the management of all of the rainwater on this site and all of the runoff, that you could really have something. So for quite a while, we had a water feature that big. And for cost reasons, we were asked to look at it. And I think behind that charge was actually feasibility. But that turned into a study with Gensler and Arup, Bureau-Happold, a way of thinking about the ponds as a supporting mechanism for life at the Clark. By the way, those of you who know grading will recognize immediately that we've basically not left anything unchanged. We were working everywhere we could to get all of this in, and thinking of it as a machine, right? Thinking of it as a kind of working landscape, which in the end, probably for most visitors, goes back to the idea that Ando had, which was that 3 very disparate buildings could only be unified by something spatial and something on the ground plane, in this case, a reflective body. So lots of Homers at the Clark. This is an extraordinary one. I know that Homer couldn't have called this anything like an ecosystem, but he knew it as an ecosystem. What you have is the hunter and his dog. The dog has chased the buck into the water, so he's a sure bet, an easy kill. So the buck loses in this ecosystem, but there's a cycle of dependence. And I think that was something of a worldview that Homer was embodying in this beautiful locality in the Adirondacks. Here's our ecosystem, one of them. This is the complexity that we've managed to describe of how complicated the client was with 2 management firms working with us. Very smart and very challenging community. 5 egotistical design leads. By the way, all hired directly by the owner, which was really an achievement. And then a world of consultants. Really, though, there is an ecosystem here, and it is telescopic. It's close in and small. It's also, a mid-ground, and really there's a regional landscape here that I think we've tried to be as reflective of as we could. 2 more Innes paintings, and I'll be finished. This is really about mood, I think, and also just love that if you go and stand in the gallery, you can see this like pencil markings over top the painting. Just really extraordinary. And this one, which I suppose is truly evocative of the pastoral. And so we have our weather and our atmosphere, which makes even the kind of parking and arrival have a great mood, or the view over the reflection ponds, the cascade of weirs, the water on its way to be returned back to building functions. A place where mood is really striking. In our talk today, students asked great questions about a lot of things, but in particular, the question about how we devise projects around the idea of the inside and the outside somehow blending together. And I reported that I think in this case, we don't have that in any literal sense at all. The material of the building does not go outside. I do think the space of the outside is sucked right into the building in this place here. And we quarreled a lot about that perpendicular wall, but when you see it in this place, it seems to make sense. I want to thank you again for having me here and for your attention tonight. It's a pleasure, great pleasure to speak with you. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions if there is anything on your mind. We have roving mics. And we have a question.
Is it live? Yeah. At the beginning, you were talking about some of the things that we or the landscape architect doesn't see, such as time and the change in the interplay of the vegetation one with another, etc. And then later, when you were talking about Hurricane Irene, you alluded to rising tides and obviously climate change. And I'm wondering whether in your work you have already, with your colleagues, arrived at a number of principles that are going to guide you in your work when it comes to incorporating considerations of climate change into your designs in the future.
Yeah. Yeah. Strangely, though the question took me by surprise 10 years ago, today it is absolutely an inevitability. There isn't any denying it. Well, I guess there are those folks that are called deniers or something. On our Pier 4 project in Boston, we're rebuilding a pier that was made in the mid-19th century as a jetty and then was built out with wood decking to be a larger pier. And then Anthony Athanas had the brilliant idea in the 1960s to have a restaurant out there. It became the highest grossing restaurant in America for a while. And then it just got really shabby. And the pier is literally falling apart. 10 years ago, a project was permitted by a developer that precedes our project for buildings that would sit at elevation 17. We're about to get an issue of FEMA maps. Well, we hope we're going to. FEMA's, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, has been demurring on this question because I think none of us is sure about the standard we should be applying to what we call a 500-year flood line. But we believe that flood line is going to be at 18.5. That would mean that these buildings will be underwater sometimes. And there have been plenty of efforts to show how much of Boston will be underwater. It doesn't take much science to figure out that all of that landfill in the 19th century and all of those jetties and eventually filled land in South Boston in the 20th century will be someday submerged. So in the current project, with a different developer, there was a decision made a year ago that we would fight the surge with devices. We were going to build at 17.5. We were going to have bladders in the parking garages that would stop the water from coming in and use fences around the building. This is kind of harebrained in a way, right? This is like looking disaster in the face. We've now been decreed unofficially that we'll be building at elevation 18.5. So I think this is just indicative of the real pressure that's on us all as urbanists, designers, to take heed of the very long view. I would say, though, that I'm not in a position to enunciate any principles. I'm just far more aware. And for instance, we never go anywhere without our soil scientists. We work with several really great ones. But working with them on Long Dock, we've understood how to make soil that can be absolutely drenched with brackish water and can be, will drain eventually, and the plants will survive that inundation. So adapted plants in this case have to be salt tolerant, quite salt tolerant. They also have to be able to undergo desiccation, right? They have to be able to lose their leaves and get another crop. So I think these things are all kind of the norm in working in sites which we know will be changing before our eyes. Thanks for the question.
Gary, I think you come from sort of an interesting lineage that I think we could trace in terms of landscape architects that have spent their childhoods in phenomenal landscapes.
Yep.
And so we can think about Olmsted, Kiley, Michael Hough, so forth. And so, but I think maybe the era that you're working in, that sort of, and the urban realm, it's clear that you're bringing those sensibilities, but with this kind of very nuanced perspective with, you know, a lot of these tough urban conditions that we're facing today. And so I guess I'm curious to know how much you recognize that in yourself. Is it understanding or having grown up in that type of environment that just allows you to see those operations and how they can be adjusted and applied within the city? Or if it's really something that is more guided just by a sheer need for urban realities today?
It's a lovely question. Thank you. It's both, and I became more conscious of this when I was asked to go back to a site I knew as a kid and rebuild it. And then I kind of maybe had a greater realization about the things that shaped my desire to be, first of all, an environmentalist. Growing up, I grew up right on the river. You know, I had my feet in the river, even though that was pretty forbidden in those days because it was absolutely poisoned. Growing up there made me angry. It made me want to change things because the river was so despoiled, and because I happened to live on the estate of a person who was fighting the fight the hardest, and running around in an Ellen Shipman garden. All that was formative. The next best thing about growing up there was that I could get on a train and be in Central Park in an hour and a half. Or 6th Avenue, which is, my favorite thing in New York next to Central Park is 6th Avenue looking south from 57th Street. So those were formative. And so I think I understood, maybe before my teachers told me that I would have to be an urbanist if I were going to be a good landscape architect. And then I think, to your last point, there's just a need. When the commissions are high profile, and so you're in a community where the eyes are on you. You do your best, get the best advice you can, take some risks, and in the end try to get conviction around what you want to do, what you want to build.
I was just laughing because I realize that you've been a teacher of, depending on how I count, just under 50% or just over 75% of the members of our standing faculty. So, lest anybody doubt Gary's long shadow, there's the data. And that brought me to a question about how, over the course of the last 25 years, your life as a teacher has influenced your life as a practitioner, and also the other way around.
Yeah. I don't think I have a paradigm at all there. I'd never wanted to be thought of as one thing. I knew when I was this high that I wanted to be a teacher, and then I found a field where I could teach without a doctorate. It's not going to be the case for much longer, so I'm going to be a relic. I can't imagine my practice without my teaching, and I can't even begin to think about my teaching without practice. It's more difficult. It's difficult. But they're inextricable. Thank you for the question. And thank you all for being here tonight.